Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's Ukrainian talk show on Pod TV, and my name is Sasha Star, and our guest today is Dr. Jonathan Lockwood. Please, Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sasha. Glad to be here as always.
Great to have you as always. And Jonathan, this is really becoming quite a strange war between Russia and Ukraine. So Russians, they are talking, and especially Putin in the last few announcements, he declares that Russia is now ready for a peace talks. And it's now in discussions with various parties. I would suspect probably India, probably a few others. At the same time, he doesn't stop bombardment of the Ukrainian cities, infrastructure, killing tens of, sometimes hundreds of people. Ukrainians are not saying that they are ready for peace, neither they are ready for war. They are inflicting certain damages, but now with their new weapons such as Polyanitsa, they can do similar damage to Russia as Russia does to Ukraine, but they don't do it. Why do you think it's happening?
Yeah, I agree with you. It is rather mysterious, and the only thing I can think of from the Ukrainian perspective is that the Ukrainians, uh, I still believe that they are preparing a follow up punch. Yeah, that they seem to be gambling the first time, but Russia does not seem prepared to seriously uh, retaliate against the Kursk incursion. And so the Ukrainians may well be preparing a follow up punch, and I still project and predict that it will be against the Crimea in order to try to isolate it. A decisive follow up punch that will compel the Russians to the peace table. And basically, the Ukrainians will then say, okay, our terms for peace, withdraw from Ukraine.
It will do much more for Ukraine, in my opinion, to get Russia very seriously to the table. It's one, two missiles, punches into the Moscow and not region, but the center or close enough to the center. So it would not be able, the government of Russia, to hide it, not to talk about it. And as the retaliation is concerned, what else they can do on top of what they are doing already.
Right.
So there is no retaliation to be feared because it's happening anyway, even without Ukraine doing these missile strikes against Russian cities.
So there's no incentive. There's no incentive whatsoever, from my perspective, for the Ukrainians to do anything except go ahead and deliver that follow-up punch to compel Russia to the peace table. And that's yeah, showing any Ukraine showing any restraint at this point makes does not make sense.
And especially it's quite painful because before they got their own weapon, Palyanitsa, which can hit targets 700 kilometers away. So they were relying on Atomax and Storm Shadow. There's a new missile, it's about JASSM to be delivered to Ukraine. But all that would require permission from US and neither to use these weapons or so on. Now they have their own weapons that they don't need anybody's permission. So they actually put themselves in a corner because now you have the weapon that you can use. You don't need anybody's permission, yet you're not using it. So, of course, there is much more going on than we know. Of course, there are some separate um, all kind of negotiations and talks and peace talks and maybe not so peace talks. But Russia does not stop what they're doing. It's a terror against Ukrainian cities, against Ukrainian infrastructure, and against Ukrainian people, killing many of them. Innocent people are being dead every day. Actually, they published photo in Ukrainian Pravda just before our program. Three soldiers were being killed. Um, after they surrendered to Russians in area of Pokrovsk. They surrendered and they were mercilessly killed. And the picture shows three Ukrainian soldiers. So I really don't understand. It's kind of some kind of a game is being played. I don't understand who are the players, what they're trying to achieve, because if they will hit Russian targets, this is the biggest move to bring them to the table, and just shows that that could be repeated, not in one city, but in two cities and in many cities. Well, it depends how many missiles they already have available. Nobody knows that either. But at least one or
And they're not going to reveal the production rate either.
absolutely, yeah. But one or two they must have, and that's more than enough to make at least send some kind of message, loud and clear and heard by all Russian people. That's my opinion. I'm not trying to play into escalation game and be fearful of what will go after that. But what's going on now every day without Ukrainians hitting the cities or anything, it's becoming more and more murderous actions from Putin's.
Yeah, the Russians' actions are giving Ukrainians no restraint, no incentive whatsoever to exercise restraint. We are both agreed on that. So now the only point of contention is, okay, so in what way do we compel the Russians to come to the table? I would say, if you say from your perspective, it's hitting the Russians with Polnitsa. I hope I pronounced that right.
That's right. That's pretty good.
Polnitsa, and hitting them with that, with their own means of long range missiles, or what I contend, I still believe if the Ukrainians have a contingency plan for sealing off the Crimea, destroying the last logistical connection between Crimea and Russia, that they should exercise it. They should throw that punch, and preferably before the U.S. election, preferably which coincides pretty much with uh, before the end of any kind of good campaigning weather for being able to seal off the Russians.
Yeah, something interesting, Jonathan, I wanted to discuss with you. I was looking now for quite some
Oh, we have a pause. Uh,
a question, and Ukraine are not supportive of each other while fighting the same enemy. And to me, that was a mystery. And actually, I talked to a couple of my friends in Israel, and when it ever touched Ukraine, they wouldn't even want to listen anything about concerning Ukraine and treated it as the, if not outright enemy, but as a very unfriendly to Israel society. So I started to look into it, and I've uncovered certain things that in all um, um, the United Nations meetings and many others, Ukrainian were always going with anti-Israeli agenda, whether it's support for Palestine, and it was going on for the last several years. And even now, after the war started, 2022, 2024 even, they were still condemning Israel and watching for Palestine and all this stuff. So essentially, they were clearly in the camp of Moscow in that regard. Jonathan, why is that? What do you think?
Now that one is truly mystifying. Uh,
Yes.
it just mystifies me. The in this case, the enemy of my enemy should be my friend. But
Yeah, normally that's how it works.
yeah, but
Uh,
yeah,
but this is very alarming to me. It seems to me that Ukraine, which now needs all kinds of support around the world, and Israel with its technical prowess, and in a
Would seem to be
position.
would seem to be a natural ally.
Its natural allies. There are a lot of people from Ukraine migrated and moved to Israel. It doesn't matter whether Jews or Ukrainians, ethnic Ukrainians, it doesn't matter, but a lot of them live now in Israel. And even from this point of view, I never heard about any Ukrainians migrating to Palestine or to Gaza, but to Israel for sure, and in big numbers. So that makes this anti-Israeli pro-Palestinian stance of Ukraine, I would say rather stupid, by not finding better word. Maybe
Yeah.
there is one.
Sometimes that's just about the only word you can use. But
Absolutely.
yeah, there are. Well, you could criticize the logic between of a number of nations around the world, including the United States.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
From Yeah, you could say that you could argue that the U.S. fear of escalation on the part of as expressed by the current administration, restraining Ukraine from striking back, when apparently the Russians are unwilling or unable to further carry out the implied threat of escalation. That would certainly be a grounds for criticism. But right now, and again, because as you and I both agree, we cannot know everything that's going on behind the scenes.
Agreed.
Despite the fact that there is a lot that can be known thanks to the open press and open sources, and the fact that we know that satellite imagery can reveal a lot. If they can be made known to the Ukrainians just as much as for anybody else. But right now, it's just we are experiencing a kind of fog of war ourselves. We cannot really know what the complete intentions are. Now, just as the Ukrainians successfully concealed their intentions to launch that Kursk offensive, which caught the Russians by surprise, and now it's an open question as to how much further are the Ukrainians willing to press their Kursk offensive. Apparently, they are still pressing forward and gaining more and more ground. And yeah, it's like the boxer continuously throwing a left jab and failing to not following up with the right cross. I'm waiting for the Ukrainians to stop throwing the jab, throw the right cross, throw the follow-up punch. And because that apparently, because the Russians are not sufficiently reacting to the Ukrainian Kursk offensive, the calculation on the Ukrainian side has to be, all right, they're not reacting sufficiently to our Kursk offensive, no matter how successful it is and how we are continuing to gain ground. They are not diverting enough resources. So then the question has to be, okay, do we go ahead and throw that follow-up offensive by sealing off the Crimea? There has to be some sort of follow-up. Otherwise, you're going to have a situation where, okay, at the very least, the Ukrainians would have to reinforce against the Russian offensive into the Donetsk region.
Of course, yes.
Yeah, they need to reinforce against that. And now the question for the Ukrainians is, okay, do we reinforce against Donetsk, or do we go for a counteroffensive against the Crimea? Those seem to be their choices. Yeah, do we stop the Russians from advancing any further against Pokrovsk, or do we seal off the Crimea? Those seem to be the two available choices.
I seems to me that Russians used so-called a gambit with Kursk region. It's actually very clever. They simply avoid any fights with the Ukrainian forces, which are, from what I've heard, they're using 70% of all Western weapons and ammunition in this Kursk campaign. Okay, so because then they have actually a very potent force, the best soldiers, the best ammunition, the best weapons. Russians simply ignore it. They are not trying to get rid of them. at least in the near future. And in the meantime, they haven't moved even one person from Pokrovsk battle into Kursk. They just
Now,
simply ignore what's happening in Kursk.
in a way, this somewhat echoes an ancient when Hannibal
Yeah,
invaded the Roman Empire, and Quintus Fabius Maximus, in his strategy, he did not engage Hannibal's army directly. He simply avoided decisive battle with Hannibal's army and just kept Hannibal running around. He couldn't take Rome. Hannibal could not take Rome, but he sort of let Hannibal dangle there with his army there in Rome, while Fabius slowly built up strength, and eventually Hannibal had to retreat. So there you get an echo of a kind of ancient strategy that was successful for the Romans versus the Carthaginians. And maybe that there's an echo of that here in what the Russians are trying to do now. They are trying to delay a decisive engagement, because if they did commit reserves and the Ukrainians defeated those reserves and crushed them, then there would be even more pressure on the Russians to negotiate a peace. But right now, what they are doing is they're simply apparently avoiding contact, pretending it's not happening, but echoing so the Quintus Fabius Maximus' strategy back during the Punic Wars. So there is kind of an interesting parallel there.
yeah, it's very similar to what has happened to Napoleon's army in Russia. When there
Right?
was one decisive battle, which actually has not decided anything, but there were heavy losses on both sides, probably
I believe that was Borodino, just outside Moscow. Yeah, it was
absolutely.
Borodino. We had a very severe battle outside of Moscow, and
Russia,
it actually had the effect of luring Napoleon into Moscow to occupy it, and then the
absolutely.
Russians set fire to the city. And
Russians always claim that they won the Borodino battle, but then it was a strategic
yeah,
retreat. And
well, you could make that argument. In fact, the Russians at Borodino caused Napoleon to have a Pyrrhic victory. And you remember the Pyrrhic victory, a victory, but at such a cost that, is what King Pyrrhus once said: "If the gods see fit to grant us another such victory, we are undone."
absolutely right. Yeah.
So, yeah, but there are all these calculations going on right now, and the Russia it is clear that the Russians know that they cannot afford another visible defeat of a sizable portion of their troops in the interior of Russia. So apparently, they seem to be avoiding combat right now, while allowing the Ukrainians to continue to advance. And the Ukrainians, for their part, are being prudent. They're not overextending themselves. They're trying to get as much out of that Kursk operation as possible in an effort to hopefully distract the Russians. But absent that, then I keep saying that leaves the Ukrainians with two real choices. One, another offensive against Crimea, or reinforce Pokrovsk. So the coming days are going to be very interesting.
Yeah, it will be decided in Pokrovsk one way or another. And mm, I don't know, of course, the same as you probably, what reserves Ukrainians have to reinforce the defense of Pokrovsk. And if Pokrovsk will be taken by Russians, it's now a huge question whether they can stop attacking Russian forces beyond Pokrovsk, because otherwise they have operating um, mm, basically areas where there are no fortifications of any kind. There are no major like cities. They can essentially go all the way to Dnieper. Dnieper, it's a very large city, million plus on the Dnipro bank, and Dnipro to lose Dnipro, it's strategically very important. area. So all that is, it seems to me that, as we know, right now in the United States, there is a Yermak and Uvarov. Uh, and so what Ukrainians wanted to demonstrate to U.S. and the West that there is a possibility of Ukraine not only to hold its own, but to attack Russian territories, provided they have certain ammunition and weapons or so on. And that's evidence. Okay, here is the course. That's what we've done, and we can do much more than that. Now, whether Americans it fits their policy towards Russia or not, it's unclear. It's now becoming evident that when Burns was traveling to Moscow in like a couple of months before the actual war started, in February, he was in Moscow, I think in November of 21. And apparently there is, I wouldn't say it in evidence, but a lot been described as a sort of agreement between Burns and Russian commanders. Probably I think he had met Putin during that trip. That there will be no use of Western weapons, ammunition on Russian soil. That was a sort of unsigned agreement at the time, gentleman's agreement, if you wish. And this could explain why Biden and all the U.S. administration were trying to restrict help to U.S. Weapons to Ukraine and restricting use of those weapons, even though they already arrived on Russian soil. What do you think, John?
Well, that could what the U.S. may have unintentionally done. Yeah, they thought that they're exercising restraint. Unfortunately, they were engaging in a form of mirror imaging, in that they thought that if they exercise restraint, that the Russians will also see our peaceful intentions and will also exercise restraint. Unfortunately, they did not learn the lesson that Churchill had pointed out, that there's nothing that the Russians respect more than strength, and nothing they have more contempt for than weakness, particularly military weakness. In effect, what the U.S. leadership was doing is they were sending a message by showing restraint. The Russians interpreted that as weakness or lack of will or fear of escalation. And so this no doubt reinforced in the Russian perception the giving the Russians apparently freedom of action to undertake their special military operation against Ukraine. They, in effect, made inevitable the very conflict they hoped the U.S. hoped they would avoid.
Yeah, it makes sense, and I think what Russians are now doing in Ukraine, killing every day tens, sometimes hundreds people. I think they're challenging the West to see how much they can swallow. Let's see if we are going to kill, instead of 100 people a day, say 1,000 people a day. What's it going to do about it? Well, they don't do anything. Okay, let's try 10,000 a day. Oh, and guys, where are you? Oh, did you say something? I can't hear you. So this is, in my opinion, simply expanding boundaries of what's possible, and there is no restraint of any kind. And I don't understand.
This, to put it on a personal level, this reminds me of something that a female colleague of mine once said, that if you're in a relationship with a guy and the guy hits you, and if he hits you and you do not immediately drop him or get away from him, you just gave him permission to hit you again.
Absolutely right.
So in effect, if the Russians kill X number of people and we don't do anything visibly to retaliate, we just gave them permission to do it even more. So That's extrapolating to the national level, but in effect, if the Russians exercise brutality and we fail to punish them for it or to show an adequate response to it directly in a way they can't possibly misinterpret, then we are in effect giving our permission for them to continue their brutality or even to increase it.
Hmm. Well, the way things are now, to tell the truth, if Ukrainians will not get a lot more weapons and ammunition and permission to use them against Russia, and if Ukrainians themselves, with or without that, will not use their very potent new missiles, Polynica, to strike at Russian cities, they might as well give up, surrender, and save a life of many Ukrainian people. I really don't see how they can continue this war the way it is now, when every day 50 people, 100 people in Western Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine, in Kiev and elsewhere, and no one is doing anything. The West is not even making any noise, even to restrain Russia or trying to do something. I just don't see how that can continue on for another month, 3 months, 6 months. How, Jonathan, how you see it?
Well, reluctantly, I am compelled to agree with you. Even though, the history of Ukrainian resistance against Russia causes me to believe that the Ukrainians are not about to throw up their hands and surrender. That the Ukrainians are going to come to the realization, well, we once again have to roll the dice and engage in another type of counteroffensive action that will hit the Russians even harder. And this would imply the use of Polynica. And so sometimes you have to take that gamble. And this is one of those areas in which they have to win a peace by being able to inflict another serious counteroffensive blow against the Russians, one that they cannot possibly misinterpret.
Well, maybe I think you're right. Probably this trip of Yermak and what's the other guy? I keep forgetting. Uverov, I think. Their trip to the United States is maybe the last try. Now, the timing of this trip is horrible because of the election is upcoming, and there's a lot of uncertainty, and neither administration, well, the Republicans are in no position to do anything. But Biden will.
It's an open question as to whether you have to ask a number of people in the United States are asking who's in charge.
Yeah, I've heard that.
Who's in charge? And it's a legitimate question when you observe what's going on with the press, lack of contact, the campaign going on in the midst of all of this, and it's a very strange thing to watch. And the only conceivable message that sort of uncertainty conveys to the Russian leadership is that, the U.S. is unable or unwilling to do anything.
And that's happening.
And that's happening. So therefore, the Russians perceive they have a great deal of freedom of action to do whatever they want. They are not being visibly punished for anything that they are doing. So so long as that continues, so long as the Russians don't perceive any downside to continuing their actions in Ukraine, they will continue to push ahead. They will ignore as much as possible the Ukrainian Kursk offensive, which, when you take all those factors out, okay, now that Ukraine says, okay, we know what the factors are, and we know that if things continue as they are, we are going to be in a very seriously disadvantaged position. So therefore, we have to, again, because even though I don't know everything that's going on behind the scenes, we can't possibly, I would be willing to assume that there's going to be another surprise counteroffensive punch thrown by the Ukrainians. It may be more on the order of a Battle of the Bulge type counteroffensive, as in World War II, where that was the Germans' last desperate counterattack in the West.
Yeah.
Although I would argue that the Germans during World War II at that point would have been a lot smarter to take those two Panzer armies that they had created for the purpose of the Bulge offensive and thrown them against the Russians. Because when you look at it from the grand strategic standpoint from Nazi Germany, okay, which side would you prefer to surrender to? To the Allies or to the Russians? Well, as history showed, it would have been a lot smarter from terms of national self-preservation for the Germans to have thrown their offensive against the Russians in order to push them back and hold them out for as long as possible, and then surrender to the Western Allies, because the result would have been much better for them overall. But in any case, here and in this case, you still have to, from the Ukrainian perspective, well, if things continue as they are, it's not going to work out well for us. So we once again have to roll the cosmic dice and go for that counteroffensive.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Jonathan. Totally agree with you. I would like to thank you for the program. I hope by Tuesday we will have better news, and have a great weekend. And see you Tuesday, same place, same time.
Excellent. Thank you. You have a good weekend too.
All the best to you. Bye-bye, everybody.